Léo Czajka is a researcher at the in economics at the Louvain Institute, and Dr. Pali Lehohla is South Africa's former Statistician-General, and they join us now for a discussion. Gentlemen, thanks so much for your time and welcome to both of you. Dr. Lehohla, let me start with you. Just your view on what was discussed during the policy conference before we look at the taxation issue. The ANC once again admitting the triple threat of poverty, inequality and unemployment, something that they are still trying to grapple with. But what were your sentiments overall?
Well, I think there's too much prevarication in the discussion and a lot of policy incoherence that when you want to solve these problems, you have to be consistent across all fronts. It's not one little thing at a time. It's things simultaneously. I think what has been observed over a period of time, and a very important document written by Adalzadeh, of why South Africa has been trapped in chronic unemployment, inequality and poverty. And he traces this for the last 30 or so years. And it is very clear that the policies that have been followed have not been adequate. It's been more of the same. And look at the master plans, refine the master plans. And when the World Bank comes, it says, why are you doing so badly? I think the question that South Africa should ask the World Bank is, we have been following your recipe. We may not have been as perfect on this, but substantively we have been following part of your recipe. Tell us where your recipe has worked. That's the question that they should ask the World Bank and IMF and ask themselves. And that, I think, will begin to say where the policy coherence has been lost. I mean, the minister of the chair of the Transformation Committee said that poverty has been solved in South Africa. Not at all. The figures show that poverty has deepened in South Africa. The 350, yes, it does something, but it's too little to even move the needle. So this tinkering on the margins and saying that we are trying, it's not about trying. It's about to have policy coherence, and on the basis of that policy, have a good idea from systems design that this thing will solve the problem, not this patching. I mean, before, the policies were saying we'll grow at 6%, we'll grow at 3%. This time around, the Treasury document of February says we'll have 38% unemployment, growth will be 1.26% by 2026. And the policies are not talking to those issues that form the basis of the macroeconomic framework as prescribed by the Treasury, which is taking us to even deeper crisis. So unless we understand that we need a more comprehensive response to these things, not one at a time. So I'm very disappointed, to say the least, by the conference.
So, Léo, just looking at your paper, and this, of course, is a proposal that has been put on the table severally by others over the years. But looking at your paper with Wits University last year, you considered the feasibility of implementing a progressive wealth tax to collect additional government revenue and reduce inequality. But that was in the wake of the COVID-19 crisis in South Africa. Now, the ANC is proposing a wealth tax to fund income grants. So what's your view on that?
So thank you very much for your question. Just let me remind the context in which indeed we produced this study. So it was in the wake of the COVID, and we designed this policy as a maybe possibly short-term response to help those most vulnerable facing the crisis due to the income shock of the crisis. And to produce these estimates, the idea was to build on a study that had been published previously, where we estimate the distribution of wealth. And so having this, because data on wealth is scarce and it's hard to measure accurately, and so we put efforts on doing this precisely, and then on this basis, we simulated different scenarios of a wealth tax, a progressive wealth tax, only on the top 1%. And this allowed us to have a more precise precise ideas of the order of magnitude of how much tax collection would be, how much tax would be collected with such a policy instrument. And so now coming back to your question, I believe all the resources that would be needed to fund these income grants would need to be compared to potential tax revenues for the wealth tax in order to assess whether the wealth tax would be an adequate instrument to levy as many resources as would be needed for the income grant. And maybe the income grant could itself be adjusted depending on how much would be expected from the new wealth tax instruments. Yeah, so in this exercise also we try to compare, and you can see for yourself because there's a website where we simulate not only the wealth tax but also we compare these aggregate tax collection to some budget components such as social production budget or education budget or health budget, and so we try to compare these total taxes with some amounts that would be needed, say, to increase the basic income grant or increase direct grants, direct transfers, or expenditure in health or education to help the most vulnerable.
So just with regard to this progressive wealth tax, as you say, Leo, there has been pushback because this has been mooted by the ANC several times during their discussions, but there's been no follow-through in terms of implementation. But for those, that 1% of super wealthy South Africans, for example, who would be taxed, how exactly would you go about implementing this?
So in the paper, we try to discuss precisely the different issues, asset by asset. And we we acknowledge that it's a difficult task to build the necessary information and administrative infrastructure to actually measure wealth, the different components. So housing wealth, pension wealth, wealth hold in stocks and bonds, as like corporate shares. So for this, you need an ecosystem of sharing information. So typically, for housing, you would need to rely a lot on municipal data, for instance, where property tax is being levied based on the value of the housing and land. For corporate shares, there's already dividend tax that is being levied withheld at source, right? So you could use this information that is already being produced, but not exactly in the right shape right now to adequately collect the wealth tax. But there's something already in place, right? Where so some intermediaries have information about who hold what share of bonds and stock, and so you would need to create from the administrative point of view. We need to create this ecosystem to measure wealth and identify who owns wealth and what kind of wealth. And so, most of the time, this the necessity to collect this information is being put forward as one of the main obstacles for the implementation of a wealth tax. And it's true, maybe it's not going to be feasible right away, like within a year or something. But we believe at least, the first step that the government could take, at least toward a wealth tax, would be to start collecting this information precisely. And this would also help to have more precise information as to the possible revenues that such instrument could collect.
Well, our guests this morning, that is Léo Czajka and Dr. Pali Lehohla, and we're discussing the feasibility of the implementation of a wealth tax in order to try and reduce inequality in South Africa. Let me just ask both my guests, Dr. Lehohla and Léo Czajka, to please just sit tight for me. We need to go to 8 o'clock news, but I want to continue this conversation for a little bit just after the news. But right now, it's 8 o'clock. And gentlemen, thank you so much for your patience and for staying with us. Léo, let me pick it up with you again. Just in terms of this progressive wealth tax, if we tax just the richest 1% in South Africa, how much is that likely to raise towards the fiscus?
Thank you for your question. So we make different scenarios and different estimates, and so in the low scenario, this would help raise a progressive wealth tax on the top 1%, with marginal tax rates ranging from 3 to 7%, would help collect about 70 billion rand. Assuming that, unfortunately, 50% of the potential tax revenues would be lost due to tax evasion. Now, if we assume that tax evasion is smaller, say on the other side of the spectrum, as small as 10%, then the same tax schedule, so with marginal tax rate from 3 to 7, would help collect 160 billion rand. And these estimates are from 2018, so we would expect this to be much larger now. Now we're in 2022, in nominal terms at least. And yeah, our middle scenario with an evasion rate that is close to 30%, which is about what we can infer from the current literature. So with this basic scenario, we would collect. We estimated that the wealth tax would collect 134 billion.
Wow, and that's nothing to scoff at. Dr. Lehohla, we do know, though, that this is not the first time that the ANC has discussed a wealth tax. And despite that, there's never really been any follow-through. And some economists have even said that the wealth tax would be one of the alternatives for South Africa. But how far would the implementation of a wealth tax in South Africa go towards closing a huge and still growing inequality gap?
Let me say that the late Professor Ben Turok did an exercise on this and looked at how we can measure wealth with the purpose, not only measure wealth. You will say, well, income is fine, but it's not adequate. But measuring wealth with the purpose of sponsoring the development activities of South Africa is the way to go, implying and actually articulating that there has to be a wealth tax. The arguments against this were not so much about whether it can be collected. It was about whether it will not make those who invest run away. So others argue that it is a disincentive to those who are investors in South Africa. So it's very interesting what Léo says, that it may be difficult to identify those who are wealthy. No, there is an infrastructure in South Africa that identifies these people. The problem is this prevarication, excuses and everything. And time passes, and now we are in a crisis. And of course, the last excuse is whether they can be identified. They can be identified because they are all on the SARS database. Housing and ownership of housing in South Africa is a very sophisticated, and wealth basically is in terms of those big assets. The liquid assets are in the JSE stock exchanges and everywhere. So the data are there. And I will support what Léo is saying. That the wealth tax is the way to go. But there's prevarication, excuses about it will encourage disinvestment and people taking flights. Now, well, it may not be easy to know who is wealthy. No. The components of wealth are property, and all properties that are worth their salt are registered. It is investments on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange and other investments that are all recorded and are attached to individuals. Of course, there is a problem of tax evasion. That one has to be tracked. So there is no excuse not to tax.
So no excuse not to tax?
The only issue is let the ANC make a decision and not prevaricate, like it has prevaricated on issues on the macroeconomy. And this is where it is very, very disappointing. And it is one thing at a time. That's the problem with this policy conference, that they're looking at one thing at a time, instead of looking at the totality of things that have to be done. And this talks to the lack of plan and planning, and not having the idea of how a plan that is designed to solve the problems moves forward in a particular way, following the motions of the economy. I mean, for heaven's sake, the Milton Friedman's space has gone past its sell-by date. Piketty has raised this issue of wealth tax. So is Stiglitz. I mean, Greenspan, who actually came up with encouraging the banking system that rigged the world the way it did in 2008, came back and said he never thought that the bad will mix with the good. And that's how capital works. It mixes the bad with the good. There are no markets that are perfect. So what happened in the 2008, the bad mortgages came with the good mortgages and then destroyed the world. And in his parting shot, he said, he never thought. He thought that the market will sort out the bad. It didn't. It sank the world. And this is the prevarication and the evasiveness of capital. And unless we understand that, we are not going to solve this problem.
And just finally, Léo, from your side, will the burdened taxpayers in the lower brackets get any relief from this?
Well, that would depend on other policy choices, right? So if you just add yet another tax instrument, that this is not going to alleviate the tax burden of the lower side of the population. However, if you use this, the collective tax revenues to fund well-targeted basic income grant, then you would contribute to alleviate the relative weight of the tax burden, definitely. Yeah, so maybe just to mention that a wealth tax is just one instrument out of many, which we believe would be useful in South Africa given the situation and given the extreme inequality in terms of wealth. But it's only one instrument, and so you would not solve like problems such as vulnerability of the poorest population just by taxing the most wealthiest, right? You also need adequately spent budget and transparent budget so that the money that you take from some is benefiting fruitfully to some others.
Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. And of course, this conversation will continue. Léo Czajka is a researcher in economics at the Louvain Institute of Data Analysis and Modeling in Economics and Statistics. And Dr. Pali Lehohla is South Africa's former Statistician-General, and talking about the ANC's proposal of the implementation of a wealth tax to fund social grants. And Léo talking there about a progressive wealth tax to tax the 1% of the super rich in South Africa.